Good evening. Welcome to the fourth lecture in UNLV's Presidential Debates lecture series. Before I begin, I have four important announcements that I want to remind you all of. First, please silence your cell phones, tablets, or other electronic devices that you may have, and maintain respectful silence during the lecture itself. Afsha, remind me to silence my own cell phone, please. Thanks. Second, if you have questions during the lecture, and we sincerely hope that you do, please take a moment to write them down on one of the note cards that are available to you. If you have not received a note card, please raise your hand. We have several volunteers who are happy to hand them out to you. And we have pencils as well if you need. And after you've written down your question, they'll happily give you another note card if you have other questions that you could write your questions down on. At the end of the lecture, I will select from among the questions that have been written down and ask our speaker as many of them as possible before we run out of time. Third, I'd like to thank our sponsors for making this event possible. First, the Greenspun College of Urban Affairs and Dean Rob Ulmer for donating the space to us. Secondly, the University Libraries, the UNLV Libraries, for subsidizing the videotaping of this event through UNLV TV. And finally, the UNLV Presidential Debate Campus Engagement Committee, specifically Drs. Fain and Reiber for putting up the money to make all of this possible. The fourth announcement is that our next lecture, you could all consider attending, will be on Tuesday, October 11th at 4 p.m. And that will be Dr. Catherine Olson from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Our fourth lecturer is Alan Schroeder, a professor of journalism from Northeastern University, who has written and lectured extensively on presidential debates and worldwide political election debates. He's the author of 3 books. One, Presidential Debates, Risky Business on the Campaign Trail, is now in its 3rd edition, and we've adopted it as a textbook for our class called Presidential Debates. He's also the author of multiple Referee Journal articles and hundreds of articles on presidential debates in the popular press. He's also worked and lectured on political election debates in countries around the world, including Britain, Spain, Ireland, the Philippines, Peru, Colombia, Germany, Denmark, and a host of others. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Alan Schroeder.
Thank you. Thank you, Jake. And thanks to everybody for coming out here. I particularly want to acknowledge Jake and his class. I had the pleasure of speaking to them this afternoon. And also my former student, Afsha Bawani, who works here at the university, who was my student in Boston, and I think sort of got the ball rolling on having me here. So it's been great to make that connection again. So what I thought we could do today is look at some clips, kind of some debate highlights. Some of these will be familiar to you and others perhaps less so. And I'll give you a little bit of the backstory on some of the things that we'll be looking at. And my goal here is to really put this into some kind of context beyond just the obvious. And so I am using the title of my book as kind of my theme here, the idea of debates as risky business. Because what does that mean? For whom are they risky? Well, obviously they're risky for the candidates. And I think we saw that last night. And I want to come back to last night as we talk this evening, but I particularly want to put across this idea that for the candidates, this is a particularly challenging thing to have to do. And it is something that they really don't like having to do. And I think if there was some way for candidates to get out of having to take part in debates, they would. But the train has already left the station on this. And I don't think there's any way, that in this modern era, candidates will be able to avoid it, even though they would like to. So just very quickly, by way of kind of setting this up and by way of history here, 56 years ago last night, on September 26, 1960, John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon met for the first of 4 televised presidential debates. It's the first time in American history that there had been presidential debates between candidates. There were 4 that year. They were only an hour long. It's the only year that the debates took place in TV studios, so there was no live audience of any kind. And of course, nobody knew what to expect because there was no precedent for that. So Kennedy and Nixon went into this thing as sort of, not really lambs being led led to the slaughter, although maybe in Richard Nixon's case you could look at it that way. But just they weren't exactly sure what they were getting into. And neither was the press. For my book, I went back and looked at how the media covered the 1960 debates, and one of the fascinating things to me was that neither the Washington Post nor the New York Times even had a story the day of the debate more than just like a paragraph or two long. They just didn't see it coming. They didn't think it was going to be that big a deal. And from that, we've gone to what you undoubtedly all saw last night, which were countdown clocks, and you know, everybody's hyping it, and for days on end before the debates, that's all anybody on cable news talks about. But it all goes back to a TV studio in Chicago 56 years ago last night. And what came out of that was really a new political institution, a new way of communicating in a political context. And it has become not just an institution here in the United States, but around the world. There are now something like 80 countries in which the leaders for national office have taken part in televised debates. So I look at it as one of America's most successful political exports, because everybody around the world is doing it, and it all started right here. Now, I think for voters and for the media, presidential debates are something that everybody looks forward to, and these are very attractive events for those two groups. But what about the participants themselves? Not so much. The participants themselves regard this exercise with a lot of trepidation, because there's a great deal of peril, there's a great deal of danger in debates for the candidates themselves. There was a famous description by Walter Mondale, who referred to what he called the longest walk, that walk that you take from the wings onto the stage as you walk to your lectern. That even for these guys, I mean, you look at people like Hillary Clinton and Trump and all the people that have taken part over the years, I mean, they're very used to standing in front of audiences and delivering a message. But what they're not used to is doing it in front of tens of millions of people. So that audience last night, and the numbers came in today, 84 million, a record breaker for presidential debates. And I would add a record breaker for Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. Neither one of these people, who has been, you know, in the spotlight for 30 years, has ever been in front of that many people. So can we wonder that they're terrified about having to do it, and that even for people at that level, these very public figures, it's a terrifically intimidating thing. So what I've done here is I'm kind of going to look at this in four categories of why I think that the candidates who take part in debates actually come at it kind of from a sense of fear. So I'll just run through the four topics real quickly here, and then we'll go back into each one of them and look at some clips that illustrate the particular points. So the four reasons are basically that debates are television shows, debates are live, debates are competitive, and debates are highly watched. And so all of those things are influencing the debates as something that the candidates need to be fearful of. So what do I mean by all of that? Well, on the question of debates being television shows, I mean, that seems pretty obvious. Why would they make people afraid? Well, because it's not what they do. I mean, they're politicians. They're not TV stars. So they're not actors. They're not entertainers. And yet they're being placed in a context that is very much about the mechanics of delivering a performance within a kind of entertainment context. And this goes all the way back to Kennedy and Nixon. And there are different approaches to it that Kennedy sort of got, even though there was no precedent. Kennedy sort of got what was going on here and understood that it was kind of this visual exercise that you had to think about, whereas Nixon did not. So the producer of the first 1960 debate offered both candidates a meeting with him so they could kind of talk about what was going to happen and the visuals and all of that. Kennedy went, and Nixon just said, no, thank you. I'm perfectly comfortable on television. I don't need this. Well, we saw how that turned out. So many lessons emerged from that Kennedy-Nixon debate, but one of them has to do with the power of the image. And that that really the values of presidential debates are more the values of television than they are the values of politics. So let me just show you here a little tiny excerpt from that first debate. And as I play this, let me give you just a couple of things to sort of think about. Look at Nixon's stance, his physicality, and look also at his clothes, because we're going to talk about both of those things. And maybe I'll just kind of narrate as we go along here. See how he's buckling his knees there? Nixon had been in the hospital with a knee infection before that debate. And in fact, he'd only been out of the hospital very briefly. And you can see how uncomfortable he is there. As he arrived at the studio in Chicago, he was getting out of his limousine and he banged his knee against the car door and the blood just drained from his face. And he was clearly in some kind of pain. On the tight shots, you can see, not so much in this example, but in many of the examples here, you see beads of sweat beginning to form on his face. You can see that his collar is loose, that he had lost some weight from having been in the hospital. So there are a lot of kind of physical things conspiring against him. I mentioned about the clothing. The problem with the clothing is that he wore a gray suit and it's a gray background. Black and white TV. You didn't have the option of color contrasting in any way. When Nixon got to the studio that day in Chicago, and everybody saw that the jacket and the trousers were kind of blending into the background, the handlers for Nixon insisted that they repaint the set. And so they repainted it, and it dried, and it didn't dry that much darker. And they kept repainting it, so that when they went on the air, the paint was still wet on the set, because they'd been trying to darken that color so that Nixon would not literally blend into the set. And you'll notice, if I'd shown you more of a clip of Kennedy, that he had on a dark suit that stood in contrast to the background. Now, what happened last night in the debate? What was Hillary Clinton wearing? A red pantsuit that was visible from the second she walked out onto that set, whereas Trump was dressed in a dark suit with a blue tie, and although the set was more blue than black, it was a really dark blue, so that his black suit, his black jacket, was blending into that background, and he kind of got lost against the set versus Hillary Clinton, who popped out. This is a TV thing. I spent 10 years as a TV producer, and so, all of this stuff is really interesting to me, how visuals work and how certain things connect better as image than other things. And it was really interesting to me as a debate historian. The first thing I'm thinking when they walk out there is, uh-oh, Nixon in 1960 for Trump, because he's getting lost against the background. And I think Hillary Clinton very wisely chose to distinguish herself visually from that background. But it wasn't just that Nixon was having a bad night. Kennedy was having a good night, and Kennedy was having a good night visually within the terms of television. He was very cool. He was very calm. When you see the two of them sitting side by side, Kennedy sort of has this air of, I'm not even going to bother to acknowledge that there's somebody else sitting here on the stage with me, whereas Nixon is sort of wound and tight and having not an easy time just kind of adjusting to the fact that he is there. And as we look at the history of presidential debates, there are a lot of these kind of TV things in which the image is jumping off the screen at the viewers and really telling a story. In 1976, some of you may be old enough to remember that during the first debate that year between Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford, the audio went dead. And so for 27 minutes, there was no sound. The candidates did not know what to do. So neither one of them wanted to be the first one to sit down. They didn't know how long they were going to be off the air, but the first one to sit down sort of loses the macho war. So neither one of them wanted to do that. So for 27 minutes, the two of them stood up on that stage like robots. Nobody said a word, and it was very, very weird. And it was weird enough that in retrospect, retrospect, when they were asked about it, Jim Lehrer actually interviewed the two of them together many years later, and they both said, you know, we're actually kind of embarrassed as we look back on that moment and realize how ridiculous it was of us just to stand there in utter silence. But as you think about the history of presidential debates, there are a number of these moments. There's the famous moment, and I'm actually going to show it to you in a slightly different context, of George H.W. Bush glancing down at his watch. There was Al Gore sighing while George W. Bush was talking. There was George W. Bush scowling in the first debate with John Kerry. There was John McCain refusing to make eye contact with Barack Obama during one of the 2008 debates, et cetera, et cetera. So in many ways, these visual things, these TV things, throw the candidates off. Height differences. I don't know whether you noticed last night or not, but Hillary Clinton obviously is much shorter than Donald Trump, so they actually built her lectern at a different size. And so when you look at the two-shot, you can see that he has a bigger lectern than she does, the idea being to visually equalize the two of them. And there have been a number of occasions over the years where Michael Dukakis, a short candidate, versus George H.W. Bush, they actually built a little, what they called a pitcher's mound behind his lectern, which was all well and good until the moment that at the end of the debate he stepped off the mound to shake hands with Bush, and all of a sudden you get one of these kinds of things. So the fact that debates are TV shows is something that forces the candidates and their handlers to really think about the visual aspect and to make sure that, or try to make sure anyway, that these visual errors that do not crop up in a way that comes back and rebounds negatively onto the candidate. My second point here is that debates are live. And live TV is scary as hell. And I say that as someone who spent about 10 years producing live television shows. I had a guest one time die on me 5 minutes before we went on the air. So behind and it was like one of those weird shows where we actually did it from a shopping center. And so, you know, people were like shopping, and meanwhile my guest is backstage dying. And as the producer, I'm just thinking, how the hell am I going to fill that 10-minute segment that this guy was supposed to deliver. Another time I had a live audience of people during a program, and it was a controversial topic, and they started a fist fight with each other. We had to call the Boston Police Department to come in and break the thing up. So I'm telling you these stories just to reinforce that I'm very cognizant of the dangers of live TV. Things can and do go wrong. And so in a campaign context, this is particularly troubling because campaigns are all about control. They really don't want the candidates out and about in a situation where they can't kind of pre-script what is going to happen. And yet debates, as live television, by definition, are spontaneous. So you get this interesting tension between choreography and spontaneity in a live debate that adds to the riskiness of it. This is why candidates prepare so heavily. And referring back to last night, I think you probably saw the difference between a candidate who had done a great deal of preparation, Hillary Clinton, and a candidate who had not, Donald Trump. And you know, the idea with preparation is to minimize the danger of being live in the first place, to anticipate the things that might happen to you in the debate itself that could go wrong. So let's look next at a famous clip. I'm sure you've seen this one, but take a look at it, and we'll talk a little bit afterwards. From 1976, Gerald Ford.
There is no Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, and there never will be under a Ford administration.
I'm sorry, could I just follow? Did I understand you to say, sir, that the Russians are not using Eastern Europe as their own sphere of influence and occupying most of the countries there and making sure with their troops that it's a communist zone, whereas on our side of the line, the Italians and the French are still flirting with possibility?
I don't believe, Mr. Frankel, that the Yugoslavians consider themselves dominated by the Soviet Union. I don't believe that the Romanians consider themselves dominated by the Soviet Union. I don't believe that the Poles consider themselves dominated by the Soviet Union. Each of those countries is independent, autonomous. It has its own territorial integrity. And the United States does not concede that those countries are under the domination of the Soviet Union.
All right. Now, he was right, except he was right like 20 years too early. So he was actually wrong. And yet he says it so forcefully. It's like, by God, I am not going to walk this thing back no matter what. And you hear the reporter not fact-checking him, because fact-checking has been this whole controversy this year, is should the questioners start fact-checking? The reporter, Max Frankel from the New York Times, was not fact-checking him. He was just saying, well, wait a minute, did I hear you say? And I think that's a kind of an interesting approach to it, because you want the candidate to say what the candidate is going to say. You don't want the questioner to start sort of arguing or debating with the candidate. However, in this case, there's a kind of an incredulity. You can almost see Max Frankel looks like he's about to burst out laughing there because he can't believe what he's hearing. And so mistakes are one of the things that the media focus on. Mistakes drive a lot of the coverage, and this is considered really the first classic debates mistake, and it's a mistake of content because there are different kinds of mistakes that you can make in a debate, and in this one it's a mistake of content. And Ford's numbers, poll numbers, in the days following that debate steadily went down, because all anybody was talking about in the media was, can you believe that he said that the Eastern Europe is not under Soviet domination? And Ford refused to take it back. He refused to back down until finally he had no choice. He really had to, but he wouldn't do it on camera. He issued a statement from the White House, okay, I was wrong. And that got reported, and the whole thing, blew over as quickly as that. But it shows you that mistakes have the power to not only dominate the conversation immediately afterwards, but for days on end, and take a toll on your poll standings as well. And over the years, there have been a number of these kind of unexpected errors in debates that have cost the candidates. We saw it with Obama in 2012, had a very bad first debate against Mitt Romney. You see it with Ronald Reagan in 1984, very bad first debate with Walter Mondale. So I mentioned that example, Ford, is a mistake of content, but there also are just mistakes of tone. So let me show you another famous clip here from 1988, the last debate at UCLA in Los Angeles.
The first question goes to Governor Dukakis. You have 2 minutes to respond. Governor, if Kitty Dukakis were raped and murdered, would you favor an irrevocable death penalty for the killer?
No, I don't, Bernard, and I think you know that I've opposed the death penalty during all of my life. I don't see any evidence that it's a deterrent, and I think there are better and more effective ways to deal with violent crime. We've done so in my own state, and it's one of the reasons why we have had the biggest drop in crime of any industrial state in America, why we have the lowest murder rate of any industrial state in America.
Michael Dukakis, by the way, is on our faculty at Northeastern University in Boston, so I always see him sort of walking around and thinking, this man could have been the President of the United States, and he has the same job that I do. What's wrong with that picture? I actually rode the subway with him the other day and had a very interesting, he's a really nice guy, had a really interesting conversation with him as we were both leaving work at the same time. But some interesting things in that clip there. It's a mistake of tone that, when you hear that question, what Michael Dukakis did there was not a sort of normal human reaction. He didn't even accept the drama of the premise of that question. Now, Bernard Shaw, the moderator, got in a lot of trouble for asking that question. He was roundly criticized. But what nobody remembers is he also had a pretty gruesome question for President Bush, the first President Bush, who was the opponent in this debate, which was, everybody was talking that year about how Dan Quayle, the vice president, was maybe maybe under-credentialed to be president. And so Bernard Shaw says to George H.W. Bush, if you're elected, but you die before Inauguration Day, blah, 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 blah. And Bush has this reaction as soon as he goes, if you die, Bush goes, Bernie, like that, as opposed to Michael Dukakis, raped or murdered, I'm just going to act like... And so the fact is that when we look at debates and when we're judging presidential debates, we're looking for how they react as human beings under pressure. And so we're looking for insights into them as people. And so when Michael Dukakis, who was already being criticized as being sort of unemotive and not too technocratic, when he buys into that stereotype by reinforcing that, it's all the worse in the media judgments. I will add one other little thing on this, because you may have noticed on the shot there that there were 3 other panelists, 3 women. And all 3 of the women begged Bernard Shaw before the debate, don't ask that question. As women, they were really offended by the wording of that. And he really wanted to ask that question, so he wouldn't agree to not ask the question. So then they said, do you have to mention Kitty Dukakis by name? Couldn't you just say, if your wife? No. He wanted to mention Kitty Dukakis. And Kitty Dukakis herself, by the way, was right there in the front row. And yet the rules of engagement prohibited reaction shots of family members in the audience. So the logical thing visually would have been cut to Kitty Dukakis. Maybe she has the look of horror on her face that her husband did not, but they couldn't do that. And so the whole thing became this moment that kind of lives in infamy about what not to do during a debate. And I interviewed Governor Dukakis for my book, and I asked him, about this moment. He doesn't like to talk about it, but I asked him about it, and he said, I looked at that clip not that long ago. I didn't think it was that bad. So he's never really kind of come to terms with why that was a problem. And then one more category of mistakes, which I would call physical mistakes. So let's look at the 2000 town hall debate, Gore versus Bush.
I specifically would like to know whether Governor Bush will support the Dingell-Norwood bill, which is the main one pending.
Governor Bush, you may answer that if you'd like, but also I'd like to know how you see the differences between the two of you, and we need to move on.
Well, the difference is that I can get it done. That I can get something positive done on behalf of the people. That's what the question in this campaign is about. It's not only what's your philosophy and what's your position on issues, but can you get things done? And I believe I can.
All right.
What about the Dingell-Norwood bill?
Yeah, what about that Dingell-Norwood bill? Everybody's on the edge of their seats wanting to know about that Dingell-Norwood bill. No, this thing is so interesting, because here's a classic case of debate prep gone wrong. Because in the preps, Gore did that same move, and his advisor said, you know what, don't do that. Doesn't work. Disrespectful and weird. And Gore did it anyway. And the audience sitting there in the town hall had exactly the same reaction that you all did. They laughed. And when somebody laughs at you like that, it's not good. So the fact that TV debates are live puts candidates in harm's way on a variety of different levels. Now, my third point was that debates are competitive, and that, again, seems fairly obvious, but I think that adds to the pressure, and that adds to the danger, because it isn't just that you're having to put on a show, you're having to put on a show against someone else who wants the same job that you do. And so it's weird for candidates, because normally they perform as solo acts, and the people who come to hear them are people who support them. And so now all of a sudden you're up there with the person that you're normally demonizing on a daily basis in front of an audience that is not a partisan crowd that's there to cheer you on. And so they don't have all of that love and support system. I think that was actually one of Trump's challenges last night, that he was deprived of that media oxygen, or rather crowd oxygen, that comes from being the star at a rally. So, but by placing the contenders side by side, you really magnify their differences, and you magnify the differences in their performances. So let's look here at 2 clips from the same debate. This is the 1992 town hall debate. There were 3 candidates, the first Bush, Clinton, and Perot, but I'm going to look at Bush and Clinton. And the Bush clip starts with, and it goes by very quickly, so be on the lookout for it, the glancing at the watch thing. But listen to the young woman's question, watch Bush respond to it, and then I'm going to play you the Clinton response to that as well.
We have a question right here.
Yes, how has the national debt personally affected each of your lives? And if it hasn't, how can you honestly find a cure for the economic problems of the common people if you have no experience in what's ailing them?
Well, I think the national debt affects everybody. Obviously, it has a lot to do with interest rates. It has.
She's saying you personally.
On a personal basis, how has it affected you?
Has it affected you personally?
Well, I'm sure it has. I love my grandchildren. I want to think that think that they're going to be able to afford an education. I think that that's an important part of being a parent. Maybe I won't get it wrong. Are you suggesting that if somebody has means, that the national debt doesn't affect them?
What I'm saying,
I'm not sure I get it. Help me with the question, and I'll try to answer it.
I've had friends that have been laid off from jobs.
Yeah.
I know people who cannot afford to pay the mortgage on their homes, their car payment. I have personal problems with the national debt, but how has it affected you? And if you have no experience in it, how can you help us if you don't know what we're feeling?
I think she means more the recession, the economic problems today the country faces, rather than the deficit.
You ought to be in the White House for a day and hear what I hear and see what I see and read the mail I read.
And he sort of goes on in that vein for a little bit, and the question ends with him talking about how he had recently been to an African-American church. Nothing to do with the national debt or the economy, but you can see that he's kind of, plugging into something that somebody must have told him at some point to say. Now, the question is confusingly worded. There's no doubt about it. National debt, as the moderator says, she probably really meant just the economy in general. But you can see that look of confusion on Bush's face as he grapples with how to respond to her. And he doesn't get it. And he even says, I don't get it, in this response. The watch thing goes by very fast, but believe you me, everybody noticed it. And that was the thing that everybody was talking about at the end of that debate. Years later, Bush was interviewed about it, and he said, yeah, I did want to get out of there. I was wondering, and this is his quote, I was wondering, how much more of this crap do I have to put up with? All right, but these are voters asking questions, right? So let's now watch Bill Clinton respond to the same question, the same audience member, and I'll tell you the little backstory on that.
That's why I'm trying to do something about it by stimulating the export, investing more, better education systems. Thank you. I'm glad to clarify.
Tell me how it's affected you again. You know people who lost their jobs and lost their homes? Well, I've been governor of a small state for 12 years. I'll tell you how it's affected me. Every year, Congress and the President sign laws that make us do more things and gives us less money to do it with. I see people in my state, middle-class people, their taxes have gone up in Washington and their services have gone down, while the wealthy have gotten tax cuts. I have seen what's happened in this last 4 years. When in my state, when people lose their jobs, there's a good chance I'll know them by their names. When a factory closes, I know the people who ran it. When the businesses go bankrupt, I know them. And I've been out here for 13 months, meeting in meetings just like this ever since October, with people like you all over America. People that have lost their jobs, lost their livelihood, lost their health insurance.
Quite a difference there, isn't there? Quite a competitive difference there as you look at the way that they respond to the question. Now, obviously Clinton has the benefit of going last. Nonetheless, he had listened to what she was saying, and he's responding very directly to her. He also had practiced like no other candidate before him for this town hall format. And one of the things that he practiced was, and I interviewed for my book, I interviewed the director of this debate, and he told me about how when Clinton Clinton came in for the rehearsal, they always come in the day of and spend like half an hour on the set just getting comfortable. He said Clinton just peppered him with questions like, what can I do? Where can I be? Where can I stand? He wanted to know exactly, if I move here, will I be in the camera shot? Will you be able to get me in the camera shot with the people in the audience? All of this technical TV stuff that just showed that he was hungry to make a good impression here, and that he understood that he had to work at that to arrive at that level of fluency. But I love his interaction with the woman in the audience, that he is not just answering her question, he's communicating with her. It's almost like a seduction, you know? It's almost like you expect him to ask her out for drinks or something at the end of the debate. But it works because he's listening to her, he's paying attention, he gets what she's saying, and he's relating to her. This town hall format, which incidentally is the next one coming up between Clinton and Trump, is a real tricky one. The candidates are particularly fearful of this format because it's very hard to anticipate what people in the audience will ask. And they can usually get a fix on what the journalists are going to ask, but who knows with average people. Or when the people ask the questions, it may be worded in a way that is a little off, the way that this young woman's question was, because that's how real people talk, right? But that throws candidates sometimes. But the town hall, which used to be a place that was where aggression between the candidates was frowned upon, because the thought was you don't want to do that in front of the citizens, has become a little more edgy over the years, and especially this last one. So let's take a look here at Obama and Romney in their town hall from 4 years ago.
A second.
Mr. President, I'm still speaking.
I'm sorry.
Mr. President, why don't you let me finish? I'm going to continue. I'm going to continue.
Governor Romney, if you could make it short. See all these people? They've been waiting for you. Could you
just
make it
make
short?
A point. Any investments I have over the last 8 years have been managed by a blind trust. And I understand they do include investments outside the United States, including in Chinese companies. Mr. President, have you looked at your pension? Have you looked at your pension?
I've got to say.
Mr. President, have you looked at your pension?
You know, I don't look at my pension. It's not as big as yours, so it doesn't take as long.
Let me give you some. Let me give you some advice.
I don't check it that often.
Let me give you some advice. Look at your pension. You also have investments in Chinese companies. You also have investments outside the United States. You also have investments through a Cayman's trust.
We're sort of way off topic here, Governor Romney.
We're a little off topic here.
Completely off the immigration.
I thought we were talking about immigration.
And we were.
I came back to what you spoke about before.
I do want to make sure.
If I could have you sit down, Governor Romney, thank you.
I do want to make sure that we just understand something.
All right. Well, I think what we understand here is that that is a very combative format. It's also a very challenging format for the candidates because the physicality of it. How do you work that space? And I think when we watch Trump and Clinton, that's going to be really interesting on the physical nature because we're not used to seeing them move around much. It's a hard one technically to get the camera shots right as well. Chris Matthews, in his analysis of this debate, said something that I thought was very funny, which he said it looked like a scene from West Side Story, you know, the sharks and the jets, like they were going to have a rumble on that set there, you know, you're just waiting for the pocket knives to come out. But the challenge here is that when you're on the stage side by side like that, the competitive nature of debates to begin with is, I think, really exacerbated in a format like this where you're asked to sort of move around and to dominate not just verbally and visually, but physically. And some candidates are going to be better at that than others. My last reason why candidates fear debates is their popularity. And that may seem kind of counterintuitive because on the one hand, isn't it great to be able to get your message out there in front of 84 million people? Sure. But it also heightens the tension, and it also means that anything bad that happens to you is magnified just by virtue of the huge number of people that are watching. Conversely, anything good that you do, any good that can come out of it will also be magnified. So there is opportunity there for both good things and bad things to happen. But we know that the ratings for debates are incredibly high always. This year is a record breaker, but even in years where the debates don't have such a high audience, they are typically the second highest watched programs of the year after the Super Bowl. And incidentally, this is an international phenomenon as well. As you look around at a lot of the other countries that have had debates, almost everywhere, the whole country comes to a stop and watches what is going on the TV screen or your device, because these things are really compelling television. So a good performance will really help you, but a bad performance can destroy you. And think of, for instance, Rick Perry with the oops moment. While that debate was going on last night, he was doing Dancing with the Stars. And this, you know, it's sort of like what might have been, right? He could have been up there on that stage, but he had other things to do. Think of Marco Rubio in this past cycle in the New Hampshire debate, where he kind of went into robot mode and just started repeating himself and became a laughingstock. And that essentially ended his shot at becoming the Republican nominee, even though on paper he was a really strong candidate who in many ways probably would have had an easier time with the general voting public than Trump has had. And then there's this moment that you've all seen, but it never wears out its welcome. So let's take a look at this one.
I have far more experience than many others that sought the office of Vice President of this country. I have as much experience in the Congress as Jack Kennedy did when he sought the presidency. I will be prepared to deal with the people in the Bush administration if that unfortunate event would ever occur.
Senator Benson.
Senator, I served with Jack Kennedy. I knew Jack Kennedy. Jack Kennedy was a friend of mine. Senator, you're no Jack Kennedy.
That was really uncalled for, Senator.
You're the one that was making the comparison, Senator. And I'm one who knew him well. And frankly, I think you're so far apart in the objectives you choose for your country that I did not think the comparison was well taken.
That ended Dan Quayle's political career. It was over, even though he went on to become the vice president. I always say that, you know, when the day that the poor man dies, chiseled on his gravestone will be the words, "Here lies Dan Quayle, he was no Jack Kennedy." Because that's the only thing anybody remembers about him. But the fact that his humiliation occurred before so many people really was the nail in the coffin. And Benson had an advantage here because the people from the Dukakis-Benson campaign had been attending the Quayle rallies. This is what happens, opposition research, and taking notes. And so they knew that Quayle at earlier appearances had used this line about, "I have more experience than Jack Kennedy." And so Benson was ready. And you can see on his face, by the way, the minute those words Jack Kennedy or JFK come out of Quayle's mouth, his eyebrows kind of go up and it's like, okay, you know, open for business here. So it shows both the value of the preparation and also the danger of stepping into a trap in front of so many people. Now I'm going to show, as my last two clips before we wrap up, and then we'll have a chance to talk a little bit, two clips from the same debate, one of which is quite famous and the other one less remarked upon. And these both involve Ronald Reagan. And I've chosen these to kind of end with as an example of all of the dangers of live television, because the setup for this is that Reagan had a very bad first debate, and he was 73 years old, and he was thought to maybe have lost it a little bit. He was a little bit off his game in that first debate, and he didn't seem somehow up to the task. And so after the debate, there were a lot of stories about, is his age an issue? And so in the follow-up debate, he knew he would have to deal with this, and so he does this very famous moment here that I will play for you. But as you're watching this, bear in mind the whole thing about the age issue and sort of being on top of things, because that plays then into the second clip that I'll show in just a sec.
You already are the oldest president in history, and some of your staff say you were tired after your most recent encounter with Mr. Mondale. I recall yet that President Kennedy had to go for days on end with very little sleep during the Cuba Missile Crisis. Is there any doubt in your mind that you would be able to function in such circumstances?
Not at all, Mr. Truitt, and I want you to know that also I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I am not going to exploit, for political purposes, my opponent's youth and inexperience.
Well, you can see that even Mondale thought that was funny. I mean, how could you not? And Mondale knew, I mean, Mondale later said at that very moment, I knew my chances were over, because Reagan was probably going to win anyway. He was pretty far ahead. I love the victory lap drink there at the end, because Reagan knew he had totally nailed that. And yet, so we always think of that debate as being like the classic example of how a comeback can put you back on track if you've gone off the rails. And that was how the media reported that story, was, you know, Reagan solved the age issue. And yet, what people forget is the end of that debate, and I'm going to show you a little clip from the closing statement. I wish there had been time to show you all of it, and if you're interested, you should look it up on YouTube, because it's worth looking at the broader context. But at the end of this debate, in the closing statement, Reagan kind of goes off the rails a little bit again, in much the same way, and the way that this debate ends is just bizarre. And there's really no other presidential debate that has had, I think, such a strange ending, unless maybe last night. But anyway, watch this.
You know, I am grateful to all of you for giving me the opportunity to serve you for these 4 years, and I seek re-election because I want more than anything else to try to complete the new beginning that we charted 4 years ago. George Bush, who I think is one of the finest vice presidents this country has ever had, George Bush and I have crisscrossed the country, and we've had, in these last few months, a wonderful experience. We have met young America. We have met your sons and daughters.
Mr. President, I am obliged to cut you off there under the rules of the debate. I'm sorry.
All right. I was just going to... Oh, thank you.
And that's how it ends. And it's a really weird thing. And as I say, you know, go back and watch the whole thing, because of the broader context of it really I think is even a little more devastating for Reagan. But so a couple of things that I think are the takeaways from that is that Ronald Reagan was probably the best prepared presidential candidate ever when it came to things like televised debates. For one thing, he liked to do them, which is unusual, because as I say, almost always candidates are afraid of doing it. But Reagan saw it for the opportunity that it was. And he was so well practiced as a performer, having been a radio announcer and a TV host and a movie star, and yet even he, who was able to use that joke to his benefit, even he was subject to the terrors of live TV and a bad moment that kind of just left him out there dangling and meandering in such a way that the moderator literally had to stop his babbling in order to bring the debate to an end. So, in conclusion, I don't think it's difficult to understand why politicians approach these debates with wariness, because they're forced out of their comfort zone and onto this playing field that is unfamiliar to them and that cannot be preordained in any way. It's a job interview. And like any job interview, you really never know what's going to happen, but you know you have to be on your best behavior and give your best version of yourself if you expect to get hired. A lot of people criticize debates because they say, well, what does it have to do with being the president? And yet, I think it does have to do with being the president, because being the president involves moments of pressure. And here we get to see the candidates under moments of great pressure. And what do they do? How do they respond to that pressure? So even though it's not a direct analog, it's about the best we're ever going to get, I think, in terms of being able to see the candidates in a setting not of their own making and that is not under their control. And so my final point here is that I think that whatever makes the campaigns and the candidates nervous is probably quite good for all of us. So with that, let me take some questions or comments. I'd be happy to talk about last night's debate or any of the historical stuff or the debates that are coming up. You all are quite lucky to have one here. It's like the circus coming to town, and you'll be invaded with media folks and political folks and all of that. But what would you like to talk about? Oh, we have questions written down. I'm sorry, I forgot the protocol here. Okay.
Quit breaking the rules.
Yeah, I know. That's
sorry. Please join me in thanking Alan Schroeder for a wonderful lecture. Okay. Thank you very much. It was fascinating. I loved all the clips. We have several questions from the audience. It's a record in terms of the number of questions here. And if you have any more, please feel free to write them down. And if we don't get to all of them, there might be a chance to ask Alan out at our reception, which will follow here. So we have about 10 minutes for questions. I'll try and get through as many as I can. Several people asked the same question. Do you think that Trump's entertainment experience can help him with live debates? His experience on The Apprentice, someone mentioned, and did his experience with live entertainment help last night?
I think that in theory that was an asset. I thought it would have been more of an asset than it played out to be, but I think he made a fatal miscalculation. And the miscalculation was that he thought, I've done a lot of live TV, debates are live TV, therefore I can do debates. There's a flaw in that logic. A debate is a very specific form of live TV. It has its own logic, its own rules, and he, one thing that I think was particularly problematic for him was he didn't know how to work the 90 minutes. That it's one thing to just sort of go out there as he did during the primaries and be able to get off your insults and your one-liners and all of that kind of thing when there are a bunch of other people on the stage, but I don't think he had accounted for the rigors, and it is physically demanding to be up there in front of all those millions of people for 90 minutes. I think he underestimated the rigors of that, and I don't think that that he realized just how different and specific a live TV debate is versus generically being on live television.
Great. Question number 2. Who do you consider to be the best television candidate in American history?
Probably Clinton and Reagan I'd have to put up at the top. I would also perhaps include John F. Kennedy in that, simply because, you know, Kennedy was really the pioneer. He was the first TV president. You know, there had been TV during the Eisenhower administration, but Eisenhower was not so much of a natural. But Kennedy's thing was he really imagined what TV could be and how TV could be used as a political communication tool, and he didn't have a roadmap to go on, whereas the later candidates did. But I think Reagan, obviously the great communicator, and Reagan, with a couple of notable exceptions like the one we just watched here, was quite effective in debates, quite effective at putting over his message, and also Clinton. And by the way, I will say that one thing that I think Reagan and Clinton both had in common that was of great value to them in doing presidential debates is they both really wanted to do it. You know, that seems so basic, right? But this thing about candidates are afraid to do it, that fear and that resistance sometimes comes through in the performance, and that's a turnoff for the audience. You know, we want, as an audience, we want people that are into it. It's like, go back to the job interview analogy. If you're interviewing people for a job, you want the person who's like, you know, just in there and pitching you and really wants to do it, and you know is going to be enthusiastic about it. So I think those are things that both Reagan and Clinton, and maybe to a slightly lesser extent John F. Kennedy, shared.
Fantastic. Question number 3. Do you believe that fictionalized television shows like Scandal and House of Cards are good depictions of actual preparation for political election debates?
No, not really. And West Wing we could probably put on that list too. I know people love these genres. I'm not into those shows, and I think it's because I don't know. I think it's because they always feel a little too Hollywood, a little too phony. Everything is always just too perfect somehow, or either that or too over the top. Although having said that and thinking about this year, I don't know if you could be as over the top as the actual thing. But you know, the reality is that debate preparation especially is pretty boring. I mean, it's a grind. And if you want to see insights into it, you can either look at The Real Thing, which is hard to do, but there's a very good documentary that was done in 2008 about the Obama campaign where they got access to some of his preps. It's interesting to see how that works. The Ford Presidential Library has clips of Gerald Ford practicing for his debates. That's the only time I've ever seen that anywhere. And then the TV movie Game Change that ran on HBO that focused on Sarah Palin and the real difficulty she had preparing for her vice presidential debate in 2008. Julianne Moore is the actress. She does a terrific job, and I think those things to me give a more realistic insight into the behind the scenes on debate prep particularly, as opposed to the more fictionalized series.
The next question is, how do you think that a candidate's style can help minimize the riskiness of a debate to them, or what can they do generally to minimize the risk associated with the debate?
Well, they can practice, for one thing. I mean, if you know you're bad at something particularly, for instance, a lot of politicians are kind of long-winded, and in debates you need to be crisp in your responses. You need to have it down to a few bullet points. And so there's a thing that gets worked on a great deal. Barack Obama was known for not wanting to get it down to just a soundbite. He liked, you know, he's a very nuanced thinker and a very intelligent man, and so that's kind of how he talks, which is great, except that you can't shoehorn that very easily into a debate format. The same with John Kerry. A lot of these people, they're used to, as I say, being up there by themselves, giving speeches, not having to compress everything into sound bites. So there's an example. You can work on some of the cosmetic things. I was really struck last night by Hillary's reaction shots, the look on her face when she wasn't talking, because she knows she's going to be on camera. A lot of the networks were doing the split screen side-by-side thing, and so it was very clear to me that she had thought about and kind of strategized about what do I want to be doing when he's talking. And so she had this kind of look on her face of, she always looked at him as he was talking, and she just sort of like this kind of, I thought, almost regal, sort of above it all sort of thing, like, okay, And that was her sort of default expression during the debates. So there are specific things, performance things that you can work on to try to address, especially if you know going in that that's one of your weaknesses.
Great. Another question. Do you believe that the debates detract from actual political policy discussions, given that there's so much concern about appearance and image?
Yeah, in a way they do. I mean, I do think that in this struggle between substance and style in debates, that style probably wins out. But I'm not as bothered by that as some, because I think for a couple reasons. One is the substance does come through. I mean, if you listened last night, you know, there were things that they talked about that go beyond just how did they say it. And over the years, that's been true. There's been a lot of research on this that reveals that debates are educational and informative. And, you know, we have to remember, I'm assuming you're all fairly much political junkies or you wouldn't be here, but for a lot of people, they don't really start tuning into the election until the debates. And so they're hearing some of this stuff for the first time that for those of us who have been closely following this is pretty old hat at this moment. I also would add one other thing, which is that there are plenty of other places to get information about policy proposals and policy ideas, but there's only one place to kind of get the human measure of the person, and that's the debates. So I think if we look at the debates as, oh, I'm going to watch the debate to find out what their transportation policy is or something like that, that's not probably the best avenue for exploring that kind of thing. But as far as what do they like as human beings, how do they react under pressure, how do they treat each other, how do they communicate with the public, do they respond to the questions or do they duck the questions, that can only be really judged during a presidential debate. So that's the value of debates.
Okay. Another question, given that your characterization of debates as live TV shows and candidates under most circumstances not being television performers, do you believe that they're a fair representation of the way that a candidate will act potentially as president? And I know you kind of just answered that, but I wonder if you have any way to expound on your last answer.
Yeah, I do have some thoughts on that. One thing is, one flaw in debates is that they emphasize individual performance, even though we know that in any presidential situation that you're dealing with advisors and there's a group of people that are always there to add their expertise, and it's more of a collaborative process. One of my dream debates would be like a case study debate where you lay out a set of kind of facts and maybe a fictional scenario, and then you let the candidate bring a couple of advisors along and you kind of see how they would react. I mean, it'll never happen, but wouldn't that be great? I mean, wouldn't that be like a really interesting sort of TV show? Because then you're seeing not only how that person responds, but their management style. Like, how do they ask questions? How do they lean on their advisors for information? So it isn't exactly, a debate is not exactly on target when it comes to predicting the way that these candidates are going to operate if they were to become president. But there's really no mechanism, I think, to preview that exactly.
I apologize because we only have time for one more question. Time's kind of growing short here, but we'll ask this, and then there will be a reception out here in the lobby following, and you can hassle Alan all that you want after he gets a plate of food and a drink with additional questions. So if you were to coach both of the candidates who debated last night, what one piece of advice would you give to each of them, perhaps?
Okay, let me think just 1 second about that. I would say in the case of Hillary Clinton, I thought she got off to a kind of a slow start last night. It may have been nerves a little bit, but her default position is to kind of go into sort of a wonky, like policy-based thing, and that's okay. But on the other hand, she doesn't really need to prove that to us. We already know that she's got that down. So I thought her most effective moments were when she was talking, for instance, about her father, the drape maker, and I'm glad he didn't work for Donald Trump, and all of that stuff. Kind of the more human side of her, or when she, did the shimmy that everybody's been talking about today and kind of laughed. Like, that felt natural. I mean, I don't think you practice a shimmy before the debate. So I think if she can let herself just relax a little bit and have more of those moments, that it makes her, it kind of brings her down to earth and gets her beyond the stereotype, this characterization of her that has been created. On the Trump side, I mean, the thing, he really can't afford to come into a second debate and deliver the sort of performance that he delivered last night, in my humble opinion, because he wasn't ready. I mean, you look at her, she had all these things that she wanted to get him on: the taxes, his business dealings, stiffing the contractors, the birtherism question, his remarks about women. She knew what she went in there to do, and just checking them off the list as the debate went on. What were his things that he went in there that he was trying to accomplish? Because I don't know. I don't think he had thought about it that much. And then when he did try to get her on things, he was kind of meandering and talking about names that didn't mean anything to people. He didn't lay it out in a way that put her in a defensive posture. So my advice for him is simply, dude, you've got to prepare a little bit here. And I don't know, I mean, maybe that's not, that's not something that he's either interested in doing or capable of doing. But, again, I go back to job application or job interview analogy. If you go interview for a job, the least you ought to do is maybe go on the website of the company and sort of read up so that you have a few little talking points in your head that you can raise during the interview. And here was a guy who seemed to me just sort of showed up and said, yeah, let's do the interview. And you can't really do that. You can't take it that casually, not when 84 million people are judging you second by second.
Thank you very much, Alan. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thanks to all of you for being here on a Tuesday night to participate in this important discussion about presidential politics and presidential debates. Thanks to our sponsors. Thanks to our volunteers. Thanks to AFSHA for helping make this all possible. Thanks to UNLV TV. And please join us in the lobby here for a reception. And we would love to stick around and continue this conversation. Thanks for being here.